Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
And hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for being with us. The week began with a prominent Arkansas Republican changing his mind, deciding the race for governor had less appeal than it once did. We'll go over that with our political roundtable in just a few minutes, along with some matters of interest, some other matters of interest from the legislative session. First, one of those matters, a bill that would eliminate sworn affidavits as a substitute for photo identification before voting. Supporters say the bill is important to election integrity. Opponents say its real intent is to disenfranchise, to depress voting. Sharp difference of opinion along party lines. It sailed through the House and now awaits action in Senate committee. Republican Representative Mark Lowery of Maumelle is the bill's primary sponsor. Democratic Senator Clarke Tucker of Little Rock is, shall we say, skeptical. Gentlemen, thanks very much for coming aboard. Mr. Lowery, we'll begin with you. Your case for the bill. Why is this necessary?
Well, I think the main reason is that when the constitutional amendment, the referred amendment, went to the voters in 2018, they actually voted by 80% for a pure voter ID bill. The only reason we have the sworn statement as a substitute is that was in 2017 legislation that I passed. And so I'm really trying to return this to what the voters actually approved and what I think will be less problematic, because there is no uniform standard for signature verification. And so there were a number of problems in Pulaski County. I think we've also seen issues in other parts of the country where there were concerns about signature verification.
Well, it has been described, the legislation, as a bill in legislation, in a solution in search of a problem. Your response?
Well, I don't think that it's in search of a problem at all. There actually was a significant problem in Pulaski County where it took almost 3 weeks, maybe a little bit longer than that, to go through all these provisional ballots, most of them because of sworn statements. And, we had one race actually overturned, the Servillo-Ashley Hudson race, because more and more of those absentee ballots that had sworn statements started being counted. And it was just extremely problematic, and we think that this will clean it up.
But ultimately resolved. Well, Senator Tucker, your response, your thoughts.
Well, first, let me say for the record that, I believe as strongly as possible as I can in the integrity of the election system, and that means not having any voter fraud. On the other side, it also means allowing every American citizen who's registered to vote in Arkansas, lawfully registered, to be able to cast their ballot. In 2020 alone, we know of at least about 2,700 voters who cast their ballot, and they did so through the use of a sworn statement. There's not any evidence at all that a single one of those votes was fraudulently cast. On the other side of the ledger, we have 3 cases of voter fraud in Arkansas in the last 20 years. So just in 2020 alone, we had 2,700 voters who would be disenfranchised those votes would be disenfranchised if this law were to pass. And so, I want to strike the balance of eliminating voter fraud as much as possible. I believe very strongly in that, but also allowing people who are American citizens and registered to vote to lawfully cast their ballots. Well, and this far in one direction.
But it's also said by the bill's advocates that it would go a long way toward restoring public confidence in the election process. Your thoughts?
Well, again, I think that it hurts public confidence in the election process when you have people who are American citizens lawfully registered to vote unable to cast their ballot. And, if we actually had more cases of voter fraud in Arkansas, more than 3 in the last 20 years, then I could see more merit in that argument. But we really don't have widespread voter fraud in Arkansas, which is a positive. I don't want to do anything to create the potential for more voter fraud. In fact, I have a bill on file related to absentee ballots that if the County Board of Election Commission suspected any absentee ballot was fraudulently cast, then they have to report that to the prosecuting attorney. So I don't want to do anything to open the possibility of fraud up at all. But at the same time, when we're creating barriers for people to legally cast their votes, we have a bad history of that in this country, and we don't need to do anything to, keep doing that.
Yeah, Mr. Lowery, would you acknowledge that voter fraud in Arkansas has been pretty rare?
Well, Steve, one of the reasons why I have not even mentioned the word fraud is because this is really not about fraud. It is about increasing in the confidence in the integrity of the ballot. In many cases, one of the reasons we don't know about how much fraud that might be out there is that prosecutors are actually very reluctant to set cases on fraud, especially if there's not any direct evidence that it really would have affected the outcome of the race. But still, fraud is fraud, and it should be investigated. It should be prosecuted, whether it changed the race or not. But this issue is about making sure that we have a uniform standard, which the voter ID is, a photo ID. That's a uniform standard. Verification of signatures is not.
All right, Mr. Tucker, I'll give you the last word. I want to hit another couple of issues, but I'll give you the last word on this one.
There are other uniform standards we could have that would create even more barriers for people to vote. We've had other barriers in American history, poll tax or whatever the case may be. I'm not suggesting that, Representative Lowery, who I very much respect on a personal level, is intentionally trying to create those barriers. But the fact is, just because a standard is uniform doesn't mean that it's good and that it will ensure that we have voter integrity and that every American who's lawfully registered to vote is able to vote. So that's not the standard we should be looking for. The standard is to restrict fraud as much as possible and to enable as many American citizens to lawfully cast their ballots as possible.
All right, we'll stay with Mr. Tucker for just a second, give you the first word on this issue, and that's tax policy. Of course, it's still fairly early in the session, but where do you see it going? Where's the sentiment?
Well, I think, we've already passed one bill out of the Senate that the unemployment benefits that people received in 2020 would be exempt from state income tax.
Right.
Another bill that's going to most likely have overwhelming support from both parties is the PPP loans that businesses received in 2020 will be exempt from state income tax. So I think those will pass through. I think the tax cut that Governor Hutchinson has proposed to raise the exemption for the sale of used cars very likely will have broad support. Beyond that, I really don't know where it's going to go. I know the governor has proposed a tax cut for the lower income earners in Arkansas. Personally, I would love to see that move in the direction of an earned income tax credit, which was, something that Ronald Reagan described as the most pro-job creation, pro-family, anti-poverty policy ever to come out of Congress. And we know it would stimulate Arkansas's economy and pull more federal EITC dollars down from D.C. So I would love to see it move in that direction.
Sure. Mr. Lowery, on the matter of an EITC as opposed to a cut, your thoughts?
Well, I really haven't heard a lot of discussion of that over on the House side, but I think the cut really is probably the number one thing that we should be supporting, as well as the raised exemption on used car taxes, because that most affects those who are in the middle class, the lower middle class, because typically they're going to be buying more of the used cars. And if we can actually raise the amount of car that they could purchase without having to pay sales tax, that's going to be a huge benefit. It's going to put more money into their pockets.
Okay, and I think we've got about a minute remaining in this segment, gentlemen. So, Mr. Lowery, I'll start with you. The 1619 legislation and its companion bill, which failed in committee, or you pulled one of them down this past week. Do you see that coming back in a subsequent session, or what?
Well, HB 1218 has not been pulled down yet, but it is my intention to pull that down, and it dealt primarily with critical race theory. The 1619 project, I think that there was a lot of sentiment that it is not accurate history. It may have been problematic the way the bill was written, that I did not specifically say that it was banned as a history curriculum, but just said as a curriculum. And so there is some excellent writing in the New York Times piece, but it is not accurate history. The main problem is that it just really casts our history inaccurately of saying that everything in our history is based on white oppression. And I think that that's extremely divisive. I have some other plans of legislation that I'm probably going to be filing this session that will actually give parents the more rights in them being able to review curriculum and then make decisions of whether they want their children participating in some of these divisive activities.
All right, Mr. Tucker, unfair, but I've got about 15 seconds and it's yours.
Well, thank you. I'm working on some legislation that I think would, back to what we were talking about with Representative Lowery's bill, is to let people vote absentee or in person as legally and simply as possible. It's too complicated for 15 seconds, but anyway, I'm working to ensure the integrity of our election process, to enable as many people to vote as possible on some of those bills, and I hope we can pass some of those through the legislative process.
Gentlemen, both of you, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you, and come back soon.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. And we're back. Slightly smaller field in the Republican gubernatorial primary, though that could change. And some assessments of the legislative session. Our roundtable, former Speaker Jeremy Gillam, now with the University of Central Arkansas. Jay Barth, political science professor emeritus, Hendrix College. Andrew DeMillo is Capitol Bureau Chief of the Associated Press. Andrew, to you first. We have a slightly smaller GOP field in the race for governor. The lieutenant governor decided the better race would be AG.
Yeah, that's correct. Lieutenant Governor Griffin dropped out of the gubernatorial race and is now running for Attorney General. He was the first person to get into the governor's race. He had $1.8 million that he had raised, and he had some pretty notable endorsements, including two of the state's sitting congressmen. But he was in a race that had quickly been overshadowed by former White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders getting into the race. And this happened, exactly 2 weeks after she had announced her candidacy. And this is an indication of how much of a challenge that race is going to be for other candidates right now, given Sanders' name recognition, fundraising ability. It leaves Attorney General Rutledge as the only other candidate in the race. But as you alluded to, we still don't know what's going to happen with State Senator Jim Hendren, who is thinking about running, but has also left open the possibility of running as an independent.
Well, is there a path forward for any of our panel? Is there a path forward for someone who has seemingly moved to the left, or at least to the center, anyway, as much as Senator Hendren? Jay?
I think it is very challenging. I personally think that, the Republican primary electorate has become increasingly, populist ideologically, but also geographically, really moved away from Northwest Arkansas, where Mr. Hendren's base is, and Little Rock, where historically a lot of Republican voters are. Now it's a much more rural electorate, and I think that is a Trumpist electorate in the Republican primary, and obviously Sarah Huckabee Sanders' credentials with that electorate are pretty darn good, as the lieutenant governor's actions this week showed, because he's a real fighter. I've known him a long time. He fights hard. If he had seen a pathway to winning the governor's race, he would have stayed in that race.
Yeah, Speaker Gillam, picking up where Jay left off there, this does seem to be even with the former president in the dock, so to speak, a second time, his is the most powerful name, it would appear, in Arkansas politics, or would you disagree?
No, I agree, and I think Jay hit the nail on the head there with Lieutenant Governor and looking at that path forward. Not to say there isn't one. There's a lot of folks within the Republican Party that might want to kind of move back towards center right a little bit there. But as it stands right now, when you look at the landscape around the state, I think Jay's analysis is correct that it still holds a tremendous sway over the electorate, and it would be an uphill battle for sure.
Well, there's going to be a primary, or so it appears, at a minimum a primary for Attorney General. How's that shaping up, Andrew?
It's still being developed right now. With the lieutenant governor getting into the race, there are now two candidates for attorney general on the Republican side. Cody Highland, who is the former U.S. attorney for Eastern District, is also thinking about running as well. So this could be just as crowded of a primary as we're seeing with the gubernatorial race right now. Griffin is already touting some high-profile endorsements, including South Dakota's governor, I think, was the most recent one. So he's trying to still kind of build off of the attention that he had gotten from the governor's race.
To anybody on the panel, it occurs to me just now that the only attorney general who has been able to successfully use that office as a springboard, there was Mr. Tucker back in the 70s, and also rather more recently Mr. Beebe. But these constitutional offices haven't given the incumbents much traction when they've tried to move up. You see that changing, Jeremy?
Well, I think it could moving forward. Each cycle is going to be a little bit different, and and so I definitely think that the name ID that having, especially for the lieutenant governor, going into the AG's race and then coming from that, it does provide a statewide platform to continue that name ID path forward, and so I definitely think it could work in any of their respective races, being able to springboard up a little bit.
Yeah, Jay Barth.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. First off, Mr. Griffin can take the money that he raised, that $1.8 million that Andrew mentioned earlier, and transfer it to the AG's race. So he's clearly got a big advantage going into that race. Although, I think Cody Highland in particular would be a formidable opponent. I do think that looking forward, I think we're probably moving away from an era where there was this kind of orderliness of candidates, office holders kind of moving up a ladder in an orderly fashion. I think, as Sarah Huckabee Sanders' candidacy denotes, you can really come from outside. Leslie Rutledge also came. She had obviously been involved in politics, but she had never held office before, but she, moved into a very high-level office. So I think we're going to see more candidates from the outside having the ability, if they can raise money and have name recognition, they can, catapult themselves into a high office.
Yeah, one other thing too I would note, and that's term limits. There was an era when you could be Secretary of State forever or Land Commissioner forever, and now it's up, or literally up or out after 8 years.
Indeed, and we're starting to see some of this kind of movement of chairs around the lower level constitutional officers. Somebody's going to land on the floor, but we don't know who.
Yeah, Andrew, it was an interesting week in committee anyway, and on the floor too. But let's start with committee. Social conservatives, it would have seemed going into the session, would be prepared to feast on a couple of curriculum matters. The 1619 project based on the New York Times piece. And a more or less a companion piece of legislation. But no.
Yeah, that's correct. We saw this kind of playing out, kind of this reckoning with how race and slavery is taught in schools on both ends of the Capitol this week. The House Education Committee pretty handily defeated a bill that would have prohibited the 1619 project, which is the New York Times project looking at the ongoing legacy of slavery, would have prohibited it from being taught in public schools. This is a bill that actually we're seeing in several states right now, several Republican states, and it's coming from some Republicans who have criticized the 1619 project, have pointed out some criticism from some historians of it, but it's has overwhelming opposition from historians, teachers, students, and even the education secretary here, who both cited First Amendment issues as well as the local control issue, the state issuing mandates on what can and can't be taught in schools. Yeah.
Of course, these were Mr. Lowery's Mr. Lowery was principal sponsor on those bills. But there was also some concern expressed about the General Assembly dictating curriculum policy. Now, it has done so in the past, not always to lasting nor good effect. Jay?
Yeah, and I'll speak from a former state board of education perspective. I think there is an ongoing debate about who should make the calls regarding curricular issues. I mean, should it be elected officials? Should it be appointed officials like those on the state board, or should it be the subject matter experts who are the career specialists who are really at the Department of Ed? And I think that's a really interesting ongoing conversation, and that dance ends up in different places on different issues. I thought this issue was particularly interesting. It really did pull a very strong informal coalition together against this legislation, as Andrew suggested. And there weren't many friends for the legislation by the time the vote came down. As someone who has actually used part of the 1619 project in a classroom, it's a not that I agree with it or wholly or anything, but it really is an effective way of promoting conversation, and that's what classrooms are supposed to be, are really good venues for good critical thinking. In this case, we have a piece of 1619 project that's not been used in many classrooms at all, I think especially at the K-12 level in Arkansas. But I thought the Secretary of Education, surprisingly closed very emphatically against this legislation. That was surprising, especially because of the shared partisanship of those in the administration and the legislator who was putting this forward.
Yeah, and full disclosure, after the fact, Jay Barth, a former member of the State Board of Education. Mr. Speaker, in your years in the General Assembly, I think, anyway, during your tenure, there were some attempts in the General Assembly, some legislation to specify curriculum or alter curriculum. Always a touchy business.
It is, and I think you always kind of wind up looking at the dynamic of the functionality versus the principle or the policy that's actually behind it, the intent, and that's where I think a lot of issues came about with the committee members this time around. But previously, they've sided with the ability to actually introduce civics mandates and other things. So as Jay alluded to, the dance comes out different at different points, and so it's almost like a case by case basis. And this time around, they decided that they did not want to move forward with this because of the functionality issues that were brought up during the committee process and the discussions even prior to that and leading into the committee.
Yeah. Creation science, anyone? Well, on to another issue, and that's the decorum of the General Assembly. Even in fevered times, both chambers have maintained, Andrew, at least a surface collegiality. And there was a bit of a breach in that standard this past week in the Senate.
Yeah, that's correct. We saw a pretty stunning exchange in the Senate when they were debating a resolution that was kind of similar to the 1619 project bill that was overwhelmingly rejected because it was criticized from members of both parties as being misleading and unnecessarily partisan. And toward the end of the debate on it, Senator Stephanie Flowers, who was participating remotely, referred to another senator using a swear word. I won't repeat it here. And that senator was Republican Senator Trent Garner.
Dumb was the first syllable, but go ahead.
Yeah, and then there were 3 letters after that. Immediately there was a motion to censure her over it, which no one can recall that happening at least 40 years in the Senate. And she was censured, and then the following day she was suspended from 2 committees that she serves on for 3 days. And this was kind of an indication of just how heated things have been getting in the legislature relatively early on, and especially as we're seeing more hot button issues, very conservative issues come up, and the debate we're seeing over them. And you even saw the Senate President Jimmy Hickey kind of implore and beg members to kind of watch their actions, watch their words. So I think there's a concern beyond just this one exchange, but it was relatively unprecedented there.
Yeah, and Jeremy Gillam, usually, to Andrew's point, usually when tempers flared, it was fairly late in the session.
Yes, this has been accelerated significantly, and you see that tension happening on the House side, not to the degree that you've seen it on the Senate side, but I think some of that was a starting point of some of the personalities and different factions within the Senate that maybe have accelerated a little bit more on their end. But it looks as if God's going to intervene here on help out the Speaker and the Senate President with this weather and give everybody a chance to kind of go back home and catch their breath and hopefully reset, come back in a much more civil and congenial manner when they reconvene after this weather passes.
Yeah, and Jay Barth, no one would question that the gentlewoman from Pine Bluff is a passionate politician, passionate in her issues.
Yeah, indeed. But I really want to, I think there's a noticeable thread through a lot of these issues we've talked about with the legislature, is the lingering power of race in shaping the interpersonal dynamics, but the issues that are front and center. And, in many ways, of course, race ties back to our original sin as a nation and as a state. And it's a potent force, and it really has of course, been over the resolution that was being debated here, the 1619 project, even Stand Your Ground, which I think clearly had a racial component as well. I think this has been a very a legislative session in which race has very much been front and center in the debates in the legislature in a way that I can't remember it being so pronounced for a couple of generations.
Right, and quite likely we have not seen the end of it, nor have we seen the end of you three gentlemen, at least in terms of this program, although this particular edition, well, we're out of time. Thanks for coming aboard. As always, thanks to you for watching. See you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.